Okay, I found another beautiful, a better translation for the Tzafririm, or the sprites, and Tzvi just put up on, let me just, Ido is here. So Tzvi put it up on Canvas, and maybe before we get for the second poem, you'll be able to download it. Otherwise, I'll read it alongside the one I sent you. It's just a much more beautiful translation. And I wanted to share that with you. Otherwise, I'll read it at the same time. Good morning, Ido. How are you? All right. Let me just begin by saying, first of all, that I received papers from a number of people, and they were just wonderful. I mean, everybody. I'm beginning to get a sense of everybody's spiritual and poetic interest, it's right on. I mean, people who are writing, they are very hesitant whether they're doing the right. There's no wrong thing, right? What's right is the way you want to come in at this material. It's a very particular type of romantic, individualistic poetry, but I want you to kind of live with a little bit of that and then play it off, either your own sensibility, the secondary reading, or with detail the material if you find that from some other kind of poetry that speaks to you. So I want to be able to learn from you guys too. So if you can find something to do comparative, or even I just mentioned also to Ben, who's interested in social history, that there's a couple of poems of Bialik from the early 20th century, the Kishinev pogroms, that have been some interesting studies. And I didn't choose to do that, although we may, if people are interested. I didn't choose to do that because it has historical background. But if there are other aspects, just let me know some other interests that you have, and I'll be more than happy to figure this out. So what I want to begin by doing, first of all, does anybody have any questions before we get started?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so the reflections, are they, should we, I guess, sort of have a thesis, or like, are they like small papers?
It's a small response thing. I think, look, I think in a couple of them, people were finding the thesis as they were writing. If you can think of something from the beginning, that's fine. A couple of people responded to a couple of jump out phrases that became the hook. A number of people took thematics. Everybody was a little bit different. Some people did have a thesis statement. But you could start from one of the secondary readings and then try to play that off, or your own reading on some aspect of a mood of the poem. Jonah was comparing it with Halevi. We'll come back to that. So I want to leave it open. I think everybody is quite different, and it's always the people in the class. You know, everybody's really has such a different background and a very different kind of interest. So I think we'll coalesce in a different way when we start talking about his notion of language and interpretation and his relationship to romantic language with Herder and others like that. But I think at this point, the poetry is something that's going to elicit different things in different people. So I do want to also mention this. There's a whole field that I somehow didn't quite know about, or didn't know about well enough. And I just want to, it actually dovetails with romantic poetry of nature in a very interesting way. Because don't forget, Bialik was writing in the last decade of the 20th century, and then the first decade and a half of the 21st century. But there's this whole field now called eco-poetics. Does anybody know anything about that? Maybe Ido, do you know anything about that? Well, so there's this interesting field. Maybe I'll get the other book at the break to show you. But a number of very interesting people. One person, a book I'll show you by Jonathan Barnes, who is a professor of Shakespeare at Oxford. What eco-poetics is trying to do is to try to kind of retrieve for the modern consciousness a re-engagement with nature, and to get behind the technological utilitarian aspects of one's relationship to the world, and to begin to do that by looking at the whole romantic movement of the 18th, 19th century, beginning with Wordsworth, but going into the 19th, 20th century, and then meditating on people like Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and trying to see how contemporary phenomenology, that it's trying to meditate on what it means to experience the world and experience nature in a very concrete sense, in a certain sense, is coming in from the back door of an approach that was coming in by the Romantics, who are again trying to retrieve something about the natural world. So Jonathan Barnes wrote this very interesting book on nature, which I'll show you. And in the end of the book, he has this very interesting meditation on Heidegger's notion of space and time and technology. There's another aspect of this notion of eco-poetics. It's done by different kinds, but serious people. And someone just made me aware of this. It came out in the 80s. It's a book by a person called David Abram. It's called The Spell of the Sensuous, Perception and Language in a More Than Human World, vintage books. So this came out 30 years ago. Turns out that this guy, went to Wesleyan, and he was a sleight of hand magician. And then he went to India, Nepal, and he started to meet with shamans and came in contact with a totally different notion of the perceptual world and the experiential world. But he's also a philosopher and a linguistic philosopher. And in half of the book, he really describes the kind of the notions of space, time, and language in certain kinds of, in the subcontinent, in Alaska, in Siberia, various kinds of places. And then in the second half of the book, he compares all of that with contemporary phenomenology of language, particularly by Merleau-Ponty, and really trying to show that contemporary phenomenology is trying to get to the same, actually is discussing the same pre-thematic notions of what it means to encounter the world that many pre-literate or non-literary societies were dealing with. So it's a very interesting way, and it's a way of trying to, how to situate yourself on the earth, how to use language to situate yourself on the earth, or language that is a kind of a pre-thematic sensibility, where what is being released in language is a deep sensibility. And one of the things that that intrigued me for today that we'll be talking about is really a notion that that this fellow Abram puts into relief in a very nice way through his meditations on Merleau-Ponty and his philosophy of perception, is that the interrelationship between space and time, and that's the notion of space-time that was first brought together by Einstein, increasingly among contemporary European phenomenologists, right up through now Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. You experience time in spatial terms and space in temporal terms, and the two can't be separated as abstract notions. And I will be talking a little bit more about this in the later poems, but these kind of notions actually come at the romantic notion of what it means to live in space, to give rise to a language that's vibrating with a different sensibility of what it means to be in time, in a way that's very, very intriguing. So it adds an unexpected hermeneutical dimension to poetry, where the poet is feeling before the poet is thinking, and the feeling is something that's vibrating up from the earth, what the poet is really trying to articulate is something that even many earlier cultures are giving expression to, that kind of that porous boundary between the world and the poetic speech. And I think we're getting a little bit of this in Bialik. But anyway, it's a whole interesting field called ecopoetics. And it's really concerned with the notion of the self. And of course, time, space, light, atmosphere are all part of what this ecopoetics is trying to say. What does it mean to stand in the world, to stand in space, but not to simply do this in a Western sense, but to allow the experience of being in the desert, being in a lonely place, just seeing the sky, imagery that I'm sure you know much better than all of us about the kind of the pre-Islamic poetry as well, of the power of the sun, the stars that guide one, spaces that are open like that. So there's many cultures retrieve that in different ways, and many of the modern poetry is trying to deal with that. But light plays a very powerful role in that, both in terms of the astral issues of sun, moon, stars, but also being inside the light, being enveloped by the light. And I think as we're going to now returning back to Bialik, he is trying to retrieve something of that childhood pre-thematic sense of experiencing the light as a tangible, lived reality. So anybody want to come in on anything like that before we take a look at the gnomes of the light, the Gamma de Lyle? Okay, so let's begin. Maybe someone can will read the Hebrew, and then I want to do the English. The translation that I actually found, I found some old books of the translation of Bialik from the 1940s, was by a person by Aronin, and he actually is able to capture something of the rhythm and the rhyme scheme that many of the others don't. And that's why I also had put up from the Imps of the Night of Safri Rim. He did a much more powerful translation of that than Ruth Naveau, and hopefully you'll be able to either download that or I'll read that alongside. But he captured something more of that inner rhythm. So let's just first, maybe let me just get my page on that. So let's begin by taking a look at that first through the Hebrew. Maybe and if either you can read that, I will go back over a couple of the stanzas, because I think his meter is actually an old Ashkenazi 19th century meter on this, which is really a kind of a three beats to each line, and it has a kind of incantational quality of a child's incantation, whereas when one reads it with the modern Israeli accent on the final syllables, we miss that a little bit. But just to get the poems back in our heads, maybe Ido, you'll just read at least a few of the stanzas, and then we'll go back and read it in English, and the others can follow it in the Hebrew as you want, so we don't spend all of our time reading it, and then we'll read this in the English in Aronin. So maybe if you just read the first 4 or 5 stanzas, and I'll read a couple of them.
Which poem?
This is Gamma de Lyle.
Okay.
And then I'll go back and read it in, I think, the meter that I think Bialik intended in the 19th century, which is a kind of a Russian Ashkenazis accent, which is a penultimate and not emphasizing the ultimate syllable. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. לאור הירח זולף בנחת בתכלת העבר המשחרר הלב כחלום זהב וכמכסם עיניים יעבר. לאור הירח בלילה עת יצלל מלוא תבל בדממה ובסוד אור קיפאון תתעלף החורשה בתחתית הרמה. ובין הצאלים בחורשה כאין רשת כסף מזורה ירעדו על רוח העשבים הגילים וגלילים של אורה.
All right, I think you're beginning to shift into the other accent.
Yeah, I tried.
So let me read at least a couple so you can hear that. In doing that, it's very interesting because Bialik is channeling several things that we can't go into in detail, but in 11th and 12th century secular Jewish Spanish poetry, which in some ways he channels in his earlier pieces, are very much influenced by Arabic drinking songs and the same meter. And that meter is captured, the meter doesn't exactly work with the Hebrew, but that meter influenced the Hebrew, the Spanish poetry, which is very interested with the Arabic meter. And he's taken over some of these so that there is a slightly different, some of the short vowels are almost more completely elided. But let me just read two of the stanzas so you can at least hear it, and then we'll read it in the English. Le'or hayoreach hazolef benachas b'scheles ha'aver hameshaker halev kechalom zahav u'mixam einayim ya'aver le'or hayoreach balayla es yitzlal melo sevel b'dmoma u'v'sus or kipaon tisalef ha'choshim b'tzachsis haroma uvein hatzelim ha'chorsha kein reshes kesef mezora Yiradu al roich ha'asovim agilim uglilim shel oira. So that's the kind of accent that he would have been hearing, but the elision of the furtive vowel of the shva and the half vowel, which in many cases was elided when the Jewish Spanish poetry was trying to accommodate itself to Arabic metrics, which fundamentally influenced medieval Jewish liturgical and secular poetry. And he was an expert on that, and some of that is captured, and that's why some of these furtive vowels go by very fast to keep up that kind of beat. But the beat, which really I came to realize in a certain ways, is really the beat of a child's heartbeat as the child is in a state of expectation. He chose, I think, this kind of rhythmic beat of the child's consciousness. Sometimes in the metrics you can hear breathing rhythm. Sometimes you hear the kind of a different kind of tonality. So let's listen to this Aronin's translation. Someone like to read Gnomes of the Night, Gama de Laila. He translates that as gnomes. A gamad is a kind, it's also like an imp. It's a kind of midget. It's a kind of sprite, a kind of a tiny creature. And a couple of you in your papers were actually saying, like, what is the nature of this? And I think we want to talk about these creatures of light, what the child's imagination receives as images of light in consciousness, and how they do that. So let's first go through the poem and get some first responses from you guys, and then I'd like to make a couple of comments as well. So who'd like to read this? This is from Gnomes of the Night, pages 60 to 62. Anybody want to? Great, Timna. Okay, nice and loud. So we're all, and we want to feel the words. Okay, not just hear them. We want to feel them. Okay.
All right. In the light of the moon gently spraying the blue tinted air with its gleam that blinds human eyes with its magic, and fires the heart with a dream. When the whole world is shadowed with silence, in the light of the moon of the night, when in dim frosted light like a garment, swoons the forest below the height. When appears in the shadowy forest a network of silvery white, while shimmering there on the grasses are circles and ringlets of light. And when, in the rays soft and filtered, there gleam on the slope of the height, not jewels nor sapphires, but droplets, yes, myriads of droplets of light. 'Tis then come the gnomes joyous trooping, descending the slope of the height, as gently they come as the moonbeams, like the dream of a child in the night. And the gnomes' little heads are well covered, with round little black little hoods. They march there to dig for vast treasures. Their faces are turned towards the woods. And as they march on, they make tremble the droplets of dew on the grass. And bursting, these crystal-like droplets cast myriads of sparks as they pass. Thus, walking and singing, descending, by sevens they march in the night, till they come to the shadowy forest that sleeps at the foot of the height. Then all of them scatter with tumult, neath bush and neath shadowy tree. They come to a place where are hidden the treasures that no eye may see. They come there in deepening shadows. Together the gnomes then deploy. They dance like young goats and they frolic, as children exult in their joy. Then flickers the light pale and golden on the black of the garments they wear. Now it leaps on their hoods bright and shining and is cast on the locks of their hair. Then wearied of frolic and falling, to rest themselves there neath the trees, they gather and dig for the treasures. What numberless treasures are these? And in the bright gleam of the moonlight, their joy and their laughter is told. With the pure ringing laughter of children, they dance near their mine pit of gold. The tinkle of coins and the sparkle of gems that are strewn all around soon mingle their light with the laughter. The forest is stirred at the sound. Thus the gold and the joy and the laughter, alas, for this too must be gone. Hurry, gnomes, for the morning is approaching. The rooster soon summons the dawn. How quickly the gnome troop arises, by sevens arrayed for their flight, and sadly they march and in silence, returning, ascending the height. And when the moon, shamed, hides its parlor and wraps its face, pale face drained of light, the gnomes march away to the shadows and melt like a dream of the night.
Thank you, Tim. That's beautiful. So I think.
Where can I find the poem? Is it in the book? Excuse me. Or is it
No,
in the PDF?
it should be on. It should be on Canvas.
Okay, okay.
Okay, you can get it.
For meeting
So-
three. Okay, thank
Pardon?
you. For meeting three, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, well, or with today's, yeah, maybe it's two, whatever, it's on. So so I think Aronin is a little heavy-handed to create the rhyme, but I think that you were able to capture something of that child's rhythm, of that. Bialik too is able to create the rhyme between line 2 and 4 repeatedly. So there's a kind of drum beat, rhythmic, and echoing sound, which has that quality of the child's enchantment. There is a kind of enchantment recitation of this kind of piece. So before we take a look at some of the pieces and also look at some of the Hebrew, for those who are able to look at that as well, what are some of the first thoughts you have? How does this kind of come to your consciousness? How does this speak the language of the world? How does it speak the language of childhood? A number of you were very strong about the relationship between light as an inner and an outer experience. The poet is a kind of boundary place. Language here is a boundary place between this inner light and so on. So anybody have some first thoughts or anything that you want to kind of share with each of us before we go through some of the stanzas a little bit more closely. So while you're musing, let me just make a couple of initial comments. So I think that obviously among the things that we want to be able to get a sense is the sonority within the poet's language, how this kind of sense of flowing light and sensibility is conveyed by a kind of glistening and gliding of the language. There's a kind of enjambment. In the Hebrew, the word hazolef, which is this kind of flowing, which he translates spraying, light as spraying. And again, I pay attention to this kind of, this animation of the moon in different kinds of ways, not only personification, but that the light as zolef, as a kind, something that sprays out. Instead of simply stopping his line, le'or hayoreach hazolef, by the light of the moon, which is spraying or sprinkling, binachat b'tchelet ha'aver. There's a kind of linking between that last line and the second word, last word of the first line and the first word of the second line that flows into each other. B'tchelet ha'aver, this kind of blueness of the atmosphere. So this, what does this begin to evoke? What is the kind of a synesthesia? Everybody knows what synesthetics is, the way one blends different emotional qualities between sight and feel. That blinds the human eyes with its magic and fires the heart with a dream. But the poem is actually a little bit stronger even. Hameshakir halev kachalum zahav. It intoxicates the heart. So the light of the moon, with its soft amber and glorious blueness, intoxicates the heart like a golden dream, and like an enchantment, and like an enchantment blinds the eyes. So it's not the fires of the heart with a dream and blinds the human eyes, but there's a rhyme between ha'aver, sparkling with the air. The air is playing on the blinding, and then the role of the simile. So anybody want to comment on how he's using the similes, right? That the light and the atmospheric intoxicates. Mishakir halev. The spraying now takes on a kind of quality that invests the self with a kind of drunken stupor. Mishakir is a kind of drunkenness into the heart, like a golden dream, and like miksam einayim, like a kind of magician's the eye is blinded. Now there's here already the sense that light is so intoxicates that one can't see through the light. Light has entered both. Yeah, Oliver, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to share some sort of my initial feeling of wonder that I got from the poem, and then more specifically the nature of moonlight. So I associate moonlight as the main source of light in the poem, and what's particular about moonlight is that it's often associated with sort of like this moment of folly or a type of madness that emerges. And I don't
to be loony. You know, we say in English to be loony is by the light of the moon at certain phases has an effect on one's consciousness. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
The loon become be loony, to be in English, to be a little bit daft, to be right.
Yeah, I don't, and it's not a demented madness. It's more of like it's closer to like the type of madness that, you know, maybe children have, where it's creative, and it's a playful kind of feeling. That's my experience, initial experience of this poetry. And then the concept of light that's so thick that you can't see through it reminds me of what I wrote about for yesterday, in a way, of Wolfson and in Jewish mysticism, the light that's somehow connected to its opposite of darkness, and it's so and it's obscuring in a way, and also illuminating. It's kind of this contradiction that allows the reader to transcend like rationality and logic, and
Right,
get closer
right.
to
So
divine.
there's something about light, particularly the mystical light, which we'll talk about. But when Wolfson is talking about mystical light, he's talking about something that the mystics talk about in Jewish tradition as the organuz, the hidden light. And I talked about that a little last time, that many in early mysticism, that the first day of creation is a divine light. And it's a divine light that has its source in God, that can't really exist in the world. So God has hidden it away for the righteous in the world to come, or that it appears through the light of the eyes of people who see. There's another tradition that the primordial light can be found in the light of the eye, or the light of the friend, whereas the natural light is for Wednesday, the fourth day of the week, where you have the large globe of the sun and the smaller or hakatan in the evening. That also, so there's what you're also bringing up is something that helps us get into the poem in a different way, because the primordial light, which is a mystical light, which is a light that comes from heaven. It comes from another place, a place beyond time and space. And it is the light of God that one exists in, or it is the true aspect of creation, that when it is fragmented, we have the spaces of the world, so that we can see within the spaces of the divine light. But it's interesting that sunlight, but particularly moonlight, is a refracted light, right? It's the light of the sun. That's one of the reasons why in particularly in Jewish and Christian and Islamic mysticism, the moon receives the light. It's a refraction. In Jewish mysticism, the moon, and not only because of its monthly phases, but because it is a refraction, has a feminine quality. It grows, it waxes, and it wanes with the days of the week. It grows in a kind of a pregnancy, but it has its own way of illuminating the space of the world. And by comparing the primordial directness of light with the created indirectness of light, helps us see something of the poem, because the way he's translated, in the light of the moon, and then in the second stanza, in the light, which actually in the Hebrew is again the first line. And then it says, and when the shadows, et cetera, and by the light of that pure thing in the fourth line, then these gamadim, or these sprites, come down. So there's a kind of temporal anticipation in the poem, which I think gets very strongly at the reflected thing. And there's a kind of anticipatory quality before these gnomes appear, right? And when you're reading the poem, you have to feel that. So let me just read you the opening line of each of the stanzas. By the light of the moon, which is spraying down. Then the second one, by the moon at night, the time of shadows, what fills the earth in its silence. And between the shadows of the copse or the forest, and by the light of that pure and illuminescent and absolute and that purified light, then the Makelat Gamadim, this kind of troop of gnomes, descend. So in other words, all of this, in a certain sense, has been anticipated poetically by the Yoreach Hazolef, the Or Hazolef, that flowing light, that kind of gliding light. But it's only 4 or 5 stanzas in that you realize that the gliding light is that in which you see this gamadim. They are these kind of moonbeams or sprites or features of the atmosphere that then become irradiated, right? So in other words, he has brought in this kind of refracted notion of light that's coming down. And notice the softness, and then maybe some of you can jump in, that it displays itself binachat b'tchelet ha'aver, this kind of softness of blueness. Hamishaket halev. The whole first line is dominated by the I and the E sound. We all know, and I'm sure many of you know, actually one of the people who most strongly emphasized the sonority of poetry was the great person of Slavic poetics, Roman Jakobson. Does that name mean anything to other people? So Roman Jakobson was very much concerned. In fact, he first did this in some of his poetry on the poetry of Baudelaire, really trying to say that in poetry there is a super semantic level of communication. That is to say, the sound level is reinforcing the semantics. It's super semantic, and it kind of reinforces that because it creates internal rhymes between words, and it forces you to see them in a different way, right? So in a certain sense, Bialik has done that in a very interesting way. It's not only that he has the Yareach, Hazolef, Chelet, and Ha'aver, but the Ha'aver, he chooses a very rare use of atmosphere or light of Aver, instead to play on Ye'aver, to blind one's eye. And so then, of course, the atmospherics are like a dimension of or, right? The atmospherics are like or, and the Aver and the Ye'aver come through. But then he picks up on that same mishaker, einayim, the IA sound converges throughout. So there's a density for the poetic consciousness of that first stanza of IA, EI, that then creates modules of words, aver with an aleph, aver with an ayin, blinding, but it's the blinding of the atmosphere, the blinding of light, and he brings all of it. So then the or and the aver and the ye'aver of the einayim, and we're going to see how einayim is the power, because the whole aspect is not a mind consciousness; it's an eye consciousness, right? Now, there's one is led into the world through an eye sensibility, the eye, not the eye ego, but the eye as the ocular. That is what's drawing consciousness, and then he's going to see by the light of the atmospherics, which is both color and the dancing moonbeams that Oliver was referring to, and the dust in the air. It's in that these gamadim, the gnomes, become evident, right? In other words, they're not simply beings on their own. They become atmospheric condensations of the light that are seen through a filter. Now and then when he talks about, I'll come back to Ben in a second, but when he talks about in the second line of the second stanza, at the time when the entire earth is filled with the shadow of silence. So there's also now he's adding this notion of dimama, and it's covered with a garment of light that is covering down this lower cup. So that between the moon light and this lower forested area is sliding. The light is coming between the trees. It's becoming between the leaves. There's something, and that it's that irradiation that he's trying to bring to consciousness, and it's within this spraying. One of the nice things that Abram brings out in this, the spell of the sensuous, is, or actually it's Jonathan Barnes that I mentioned earlier. He plays on a lecture that Heidegger had given in the 1930s at the anniversary of the death of Rilke, and the name of the lecture was "What Are Poets For?" What are poets for? Barnes answers that poets are there to mediate between the self and the world. Poets are there to mediate, to make world and make self at the same time, right? There's a making of self and making of the world, and that's something part of this, of the ethics of the eco-poetics, right? It's to restore our consciousness to something that has been alienated either by technology or by repression. And here we're coming back to this through Bialik's deeper consciousness. But I wanted to emphasize this at the fourth line, this kind of refined, purified light, right? It's a kind of ethereal, transcendent, divine light. It's not God light, but it's a godly light. It's a heavenly light. And that light appears as a kind of sparkling gemstones. Then there comes the tens of thousands of the spraying of that light upon the glistening glow of the earth. Then the makila of the garment, then they come down. In other words, they are the manifestation to consciousness of the refracted light of the moon that hits the earth, and that produces a further consciousness. Their reality is a cognitive, verbal reality of that. So Ben, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say also in relation to the pair Ha'aver and Ya'aver, I think also you were talking about Ha'aver connected to light, but Ya'aver also connected to Or, as in like skin.
Exactly. He's picking up the Or Hayorech, exactly. Right,
and so I think there's a way in which light can have this essence of physical production. And we're talking about kind of light as preceding the gnomes that's coming down to earth, but also kind of this pair of light and skin as having kind of like a duality of light as this ethereal, heavenly substance that is visible, and then the production of something physical or material from light.
Actually, lovely. That's right. And notice here in this, I guess it's the first, second, third, fourth, the fifth one, where it says, "'Tis then coming the gnomes, joy stooping, descending the slope of the height." In the Hebrew, it's Sha'a, the third line, Sha'anana Bakachalom Yeled Katan, with the joy of like the dream of a young child, with the pleasures of the irradiation now of the livana. So what is the work here of the simile? We've been talking a little bit about similes. What is this? as gently they come as the moonbeams, like the dream of a child. The interesting thing about the concretization of poems here is there is simultaneously immediacy and the concreteness of physical experience, but yet the displacement. What is the role? What is the metaphor? What is the simile doing? Is it displacing or is it joining something together? Right? Okay, simile can do two things, right? The like as can bring something of the otherness of the world into presence, but the like as also is disjunctive. So that's the question for the poet. How is the poet using simile? Is it conjunctive or disjunctive? Or when he, in this particular case, when it's like the dream of a child in the night, what has he now evoked that he hasn't evoked before? What does he want us to begin to be thinking about? Anybody? What are your thoughts? I'm trying to evoke and re-experience with you, even though we're trying to work between these languages, something of the incantation of the poet who's trying to recreate a child's consciousness in adult language, who's trying to rejoin the world and rejoin the mystery of light in a way that has, this is the paradox. He's trying to create the immediacy, not of vision in which I'm aware of myself seeing, but the scene is coming to me. What is seen is affecting my seeing. It's not like I see and I see the scene. The scene is what directs itself immediately to me, and he's trying to kind of bring us back to a way of sensibility that we've lost, right? That there's an animation to the world that we feel self-conscious about, and that animation isn't always described now in similes. There's the dreaming of the night. There's the sparkling of color, right? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Anybody?
Yeah, I think
Please,
the first thing that comes to mind, I guess, is there's something ironic about the employment of the simile, saying, it's like the dream of a little kid, but that is in essence what it is, right? It's the dream of a little kid, so it's not like that. And then this gets mirrored at the very last stanza of the poem. They disappear like a dream of night, or something like that. כחלום חזיון לילה. So, I mean, they don't disappear like a dream of the night. They are a dream of the night. So the simile kind of, I guess, is, you could say maybe that it's an ironic employment or something like that. And there is another similarity here, that these gnomes, it's not exactly clear whether they kind of, he described the light coming down, kind of dripping on the hill, the moonlight, and then he said the gnomes come down, but it's not clear exactly somewhere there around the fourth stanza whether they aren't in fact these splinters of light. So then they look like, so these splinters of light, it's an implicit simile, look like the gnomes. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. There's an enchantment of consciousness, right? Even this thing that we just we're talking about, where he talks about that the English, the gnomes' little heads are well covered with rounded black little hoods. So there's utsnifim agulim shchorim itsnifu roshei aktanim. There's this feel by the poetic rhyme of this feeling of the covering, and the dark and the light are intermixed, the same way that he talks a little bit later about the stains of this pure light. the flicker of the pale light and the golden that are dancing upon their garments, the flickers in the light, pale and golden. But that translation doesn't quite get it, because the kitmei ha'ora ha'chibrim is there's light. The pure light is also this. The shadow is a kind of a stain on the light, and this mixture between light and shade, light that all of you are talking about. That each one, without that darkness, the light would not be illumined, and the illumination is now affecting the darkness. And he's trying to capture something of that fragmented quality, but the constant use of new images of whether the light is dancing off the moisture of the field, the risisim, which is really this kind of the moisture color, but risis is also a fragmentation. It's a brokenness, right? The same way he talks about the fragmented of a kind of glass that is has multi prisms of the light that comes into the glass that is displayed in a fragmented way. He's trying to capture this in multiple forms. Anybody? Yes, Oliver, please.
Yeah, just a quick question. In the second stanza, the third line.
Second stanza, third line.
The translator uses the word garment at the end.
Ubesut or kipaon titalef. Where he translates, when in dim frosted light like a garment.
Yeah, thank you. And I was
So
wondering.
I think that's not a good. So it's really he hasn't yet meant the subject, of course, of the gnomes who have not yet appeared in the poem, right? So they are already covered here, and he hasn't yet talked about their little hoods covering them. But he's saying the covering of light of this frozen light. There's something about light that has this crystalline quality. Titalef, hachursha betachtita. So the chursha, which is the copse or the forested area beneath the moon, is now irradiated underneath this covering of light. So in a certain sense, the anticipation is there are multiple levels. The anticipation of the gnomes who are hooded within the light is already anticipated by this light hooding over the earth. Right, so he gets it both at the larger physical level and the shorter level of these kind of small moonbeams, which have a kind of a dark aura. So there's a paradox here, right? Because aura is usually the light that allows the face or the illumination like a halo to be seen. So you would think that the aura would allow the darkness to be seen, and now we're seeing that the dark has a quality that the light is seen, and then the light of the, so it's series of layers. The light of the moon then becomes like a cloaking which covers over the darkened forest, but then is illumined from within. And the light that's breaking down through the trees and the leaves and the branches are part of, it's not just the moonbeam, but that's part of this fragmentation that is enchanting his consciousness, and that he then displaces through the crystalline of the glass, that he displaces. And the gnomes are this actualization of this consciousness, right? They are the troops of the mystery of the fragments of light that the child is seeing, that they're dancing, they're playing. He uses all kinds of very strong language that Vishaon, he talks about, the Afutsu Vishaon. They're in this kind of astonishing way, or he uses many other terms, which are the frivolous, the escapade, the dancing. The gnomes are at a borderline of consciousness, right? They're at a borderline of reality. They're real. They're real, but not just real in poetry. They're real as the tangibility of the mystery of sight. Right. So I think what he's trying. I think what the So let me just try another way. I'm trying to evoke from you guys some different kind of response, but what is the relationship that you may feel between the time of the poem and the spatial experience of space? In other words, the movement of the various stanzas is moving in time. And each movement of the stanzas is taking you in time, but through a different quality of space, right? But then in a certain sense, the whole of it is one ecstatic vision that transcends time and space, right? I'm trying to get you to sense, what is the poet doing? He brings you into time space through the slow interweaving of similes and images. But in a certain sense, it's an omnipresence that he then has to step back for and give you a series of separate visuals so that you can bring your consciousness into a kind of cumulative experience. The poet just can't, if he just gave you one stanza, it wouldn't work, right? He has to, in a certain sense, bring your eye and your sensibility and your breathing rhythm into a fullness. Yes, Timna, you're okay, good.
Yeah, I'm just like on that point thinking about the way in which even though it seems like he's trying to show the reader that even though this kind of like scene is so dependent on the temporality and the space in which it exists, by giving us all of these similes, he's kind of also showing us that light is more than just temporality, right? That it's like it's a completely different way of seeing, which is just like trying to bring us back to childhood. It's like it's trying to elevate you past the kind of feeling that we are so time space dependent. Yeah, those are just my thoughts.
Right. So anybody else? I mean, there's a description, but it transcends description. The description is to bring you into the dimension of awareness, right? And that's the mystery, that he's using a kind of poetic convergence of time space.
Right.
And that by slowly image by after image, and so in a certain sense, the very fragmentation, but let's put it this way, I hadn't thought about it precisely this way, but very frequently, the gnomes reflect the crystalline awareness of light coming through glass. The gnomes reflect the multiple fragments of light that are bouncing off the dewy nighttime grass, like the Risise Lila, right? Off of the grass. The light is reflecting the blue, in glorious blueness of the Techelet that's flowing down in this odd colored way, streaming through the trees. In a certain sense, and I'm wondering how you're feeling about that, there's a temporality of spatiality, but if you say that the archetypal experience that he has is the bursting of fragmentations of light, right? And now it's fragment, which is wholeness in a certain sense, but in a different kind of a wholeness. You might say, and I'm wondering your response, that he needs all of these separate stanzas of the poem because they actualize as poem the multiple ways in which light can irradiate in its fragmentary form. You see what I'm saying? The same way that light is refracted through glass, he's saying, or that light bounces off the moisture of the earth, or light is fragmented between light and darkness, he is able to capture that in a kind of poetic fullness by the multiplicity of the stanzas. And going through that, we're not asked to stay in any one stanza or in any one time frame, but in a certain sense, they become that interior experience of the refraction of being in the light. At least that's my sense. Anybody have any thoughts?
I think also there's a way in which light is embodied in the language itself. And so, I mean, we talked about kind of.
Give us it's all over the place. So give us some examples that strike you.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the example on the bottom of page 67 in the Hebrew. I think it's translated.
I have a different. So just read
sorry.
that you have in front of you, and then I'll find it.
It's Tisha Asha al Meorat Hatahav. So I think it's translated in English as the gnomes dancing.
Yeah.
They,
okay, go on. Yeah, I got.
Yeah. Oh, they dance near their mine pit of gold, I think is the English.
Right.
So, but
is this the Utzlil Dinarei Zahav V'Chetem? Rak Avnei Chen Im Or Sahar. Right here, he's playing on the sound, but the tzlil of the golden coins is also playing on sail, which is the shadow. Right, it's light, darkness. There's a kind of glistening that it's coming, and then it's a kind of a sparkling like lightning off gemstones, like the light of the moon, mixed together b'tzchok hatalulim in this kind of frenzied laughter, right? This tzchok ta'alulim, because normally ta'alulim is a negative, and here it's this kind of ecstatic, frenzied joy. Yar ishu dumiyat hayah. The silence is shaking of the forest with this. It's the reverberation. It's the resonance of lights. Is that what you were? Was that the image you were getting at, or a different one?
Yeah, I mean that's a good passage. I don't think that's the passage I was looking at actually.
Okay,
but,
you look at the next one. Tzchok al itzutza b'zahav.
Yeah, 2 stanzas before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mean tishasha al ma'urat? Yeah. So here again, let's go back to look at that whole thing. I'll read it in the I'll translate it. U'le'or hayoreach haba here, and by the light of this luminous yoreach. So he's choosing a term bahir, which was a term that is a whole mystical background to the word bahir. It's a luminosity that's very bitzchok tzalul tzach tzachok giladim. Right? I think you've captured that. The laugh, the tzchok tzalul, the tzitza, tzchok tzalul tzach, the laughter of the pure laughter, tzchok tzach, tzachok giladim. So this issue that the light has a kind of frenzied joy about it, right? Tishasha al ma'urat hazahav, plays or has pleasure, but tishasha also for the Hebrew plays on shah, which means to see. Shua means to see as well. Tishasha to have joy. Al ma'urat hazahav. Ma'urat hazahav is a kind of a cave of gold, but the ma'ura can also be the hive of a bee, right? The ma'ura, but the ma'ura is also playing on light. Then he has utzchak adat agamadim. That's the joy of them. So there's this frolicking, this merriment of the play of light. We talk about the play of light, but here he's actually actualizing the play of light. So what the poet is doing is he's personifying and allowing us to live the images, right? Anybody want to pick up on any of these things? So let me go just to the end, and then I want to come back to maybe Jonah made some comments about the Halevi poem that we can pick up. So at the end, Uva Halet Hasahar Hanichlam. In the covering, that when the Sahar, another imagery of the moon, covers is abashed and covers over et panav, covers its face, hachivrim, its shining face, milamala, from on high, yavo vitseil hagmandim. These gnomes go into the shadows, yimogu kachalom chezyon laila, and they melt away like a dream of the vision of the night. So there's a kind of interesting internal rhyme and poem between the Sahar Hanichlam, the abashed Sahar, and the Chalom, right? There's a kind of play between this this shame and the dream that fades away. There's this kind of different sense of temporality, right? Anybody want to pick up on anything I haven't said so far about your feeling about the poem, how it struck you, or any particular line that you want to kind of zero in on?
Yeah, I just had
Oliver, please.
a quick question, just about the coverings and the garments. And it just reminds me of how in Wolfson's text again he mentions that God kind of in Jewish mysticism, that I think it was in the Zohar, that God kind of covers himself in a garment of
Light.
darkness or light that is perceived kind of as simultaneously.
Yeah, so I think
is that at play here?
You're absolutely right. So let me just spell that out for people. That's it's a famous image that goes back to Psalm 104, right? That God covered himself with light like a garment, or kasalma. He'll be, and what the ancient mystics were trying to get, and it appears very frequently in liturgical poetry, is another way to speak of divine creation. It's as if the hidden God, the unsayable God, the unseeable God, is concealed in a garment of light, and the garment of light is that effulgence that comes from an unsayable dark source. Now, the darkness, in a certain sense, is what's unseeable, unsayable, unknowable, right? The nothing, the divine nothing, which is darkness. Or the Christian mystics and Jewish mystics speak of what's often called a luminal darkness. They speak of that paradox, a luminal darkness. Now, in ordinary speech, darkness can't be light and light can't be dark, but there's this sense that there's an effulgence of consciousness that comes from a transcendental place. Then the question, and in this particular case, the divine or the divine name or the divine energy or the source of all being creates this world by robing itself in light, right? And that light then is the creation. He's maybe alluding to that, but that was your association as well. As long as we're talking about that, this imagery of light very frequently, we talked earlier about or as light and blindness as aver, and light and aver with ayin to be blindness. The early Jewish mystics playing on Genesis 1 make it that Adam, the first Adam, the primordial Adam, was a creature of luminosity and light. And only after sin does his garment of light or change to a garment of skin, which is or with an ayin, right? And that there is this transmutation, that our bodies are no longer luminescent, and that the same way that the covering of the world that we call nature is the covering of is a concealment of the divine light. That would be he's not, Bialik actually talks about that in other kind of ways, but that notion of inner and outer, that the garment is a covering of an inner light, that the world, in fact, is the radiance. So it's an inversion of the creation, right? In the creation, God is the inner source of an outer illumination. And then for the created world, for the mystic, the divine light is hidden within the outer concealment, right? And that is the garment, that's the covering, right? So in a certain sense, these gnomes in their coverings reflect that kind of the hiddenness of the mystery. And that's part of what's so astonishing about the poem. The mystery is sometimes it's seeable, but it's only seeable in fragments, and that it's something that's inside and outside. Yes, Adrian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and also that
Adrian,
you
no,
see-
Adrian is also an expert on medieval Christian poetry, and so what?
Yeah, and you only see the mystery through the garments, right? Otherwise, the mystery would not be accessible in any way. It's that the garments are the mediation.
Yes, yes, yes.
And could not the gnomes be an allusion to the sparks, right? The
Nitzot, yes, well,
It seems so.
he uses that term. The Nitzot is a fragment of light that's a spark, which is a fragment of the divine light. He doesn't use it in a way that he wants you to associate the Jewish mysticism, because he's really a romantic poet who is speaking in a kind of secular religious way. But when he uses that imagery, the culture would evoke, it's evocative to that. Yes, yeah. All of his language has enormous evocation, but he does, in order for these images to convey a certain mystical or other sensibility, you'd have to have the clustering of metaphors in combination. And so, but he's only taken words as separate words, so that you don't feel this as allusions to a much larger imagery. Ido, you had
Yeah, I have a question, Professor.
Sure.
I'm wondering about this, like,
this one?
this character of the Gamadim.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, this poem is like often seen as a precursor of the Tzafririm, of the imps, and
Right.
then with the Tzafririm, there is a debate on where this figure comes from. It has roots obviously in the Jewish tradition, but also in the Zephyrs, which come from other cultures. So I'm just wondering about the cultural reference of the gnomes, and how prominent is it in Jewish traditions? I mean, I was able to find like a quote from Yechezkel that mentions Gamadim, but isn't there a lot here that is other than the Jewish mystical tradition, kind of a more Russian?
I think he's
folkloristic-
tapping into Russian folkloristic traditions of little imps that go around with hooded capes that come in troops, and that come in 7 by 7, which is a kind of a magical number of these troops. So he is accessing Russian folk images at the same time. The word Gamadim is never used in Jewish mysticism or Jewish religious poetry, ever, right? And as we'll come back, we see that Tzafrir is really based on a Talmudic term that comes in from the Aramaic. So it's his genius is to capture something that's onomatopoetic. The Tzafrir, which is the tzip of the chirping of the birds, and Zephyr is really Zephyr as breeze in the Greek. As we'll see, Zephyr it really is breeze in Greek, but Zephyr is like a tzipor, and as a kind of a bird, or sipper. So whether there is a link here between the sound of the breeze and the bird chirping and the tzipor is hard to know. But those kinds of overlaps between certain forms of Greek and early Hebrew through early Phoenician trade is not impossible. Yeah. Anybody else want to pick up? So before we take a little bit of a break, maybe Jonah, you had some nice comments about linking this back to the Halevi. Maybe you want to share that with the people. I think your light is on.
Yeah, sorry, it's a
Yeah,
window.
so
I'm just in
maybe
a
you,
bad
oh,
spot.
so maybe you make a couple of comments. Jonah's piece compared that with the Halevi poem, which is of course a 12th century piece of Jewish Spanish secular Jewish Spanish poetry, which is very much influenced by certain kind of Greek themes, but also by Arabic themes as well, about temporality. So what were you going to say?
Yeah, so I just I found it interesting. It's the Halevi poem "To the Soul," which is it's like the bottom right of that page that's on canvas. And I found it interesting that in "To the Soul" there's like this like motif of like childhood that Bialik also plays with. But like the point of "To the Soul" is that like the protagonist, the subject, whatever of the poem is told to kind of like divorce him or herself from this like childlike, the bosom of childhood is the translation,
Mhm.
and like kind of like abandon this comfort to serve God and to like engage in like religious devotion. And it's like the motif of childhood serves as like kind of like a cocoon from which like the subject must emerge. And then I thought, I mean, I wasn't sure how much to say Bialik was engaging directly with that poem specifically, but Bialik definitely like uses that motif in like Gnomes of the Night in describing like childhood. And there's so many, he uses like metaphors and similes of the laughter of child's and of like child's play, but kind of removes that like the punchline that Halevi has, where you then need to like emerge from that childlike state. And he kind of just sits in it, and that's kind of like the climax, it seems, of experience in the Bialik poem.
Yeah.
And I found that just
I
being
think you're
interesting, like,
absolutely right,
twisting.
and it was one of the things that was in my mind when I compared that. A lot of the language and the theme Bialik is drawing from 12th century poetry. Yeshena b'cheik yaldut, you who sleep in the bosom of childhood. Right? Why do you keep sleeping? And then he goes on, and many of the terms that appear here appear in the poems that we've been reading. Right? So maybe this would be an occasion for me to raise the question that I'd like to hear. You know, we're all of us on this in this gallery are there's a spectrum of ages, right? Bialik is speaking from the this, as opposed to the other poems, which is much more of a lament poem. This is trying to evoke the experience of childhood again, right? Because childhood as a certain type of sensibility and alertness to the irradiation of the world into the eyes and the sensibility. The Halevi is reflecting a very different motif that I'll mention, but I'm not sure Bialik is directly counterpointing, but in this medieval poetry, it's often been called by poets of the Spanish Golden Age and who linked up with Arabic poetry. It's called the compunctious poet. That's the way some people have referred to it. That is to say, there's this motif that when a person has been enjoying the wine, women, and song poems, or the gazelle poems that appear in the Spanish Jewish poetry, very much influenced by the Arabic poetry. At a certain point, the poet says, well, you're now 30 or 40 years old. 40 is already considered to be beginning to be older age. You have to be thinking about transience and life and death. So why are you spending your time with pleasure? You should be thinking about mortality. It's sort of like a poem at the cusp of transformation, right? That now is the time that you should be thinking of death and not the pleasures of the body. and thinking about God, and not about rhyme schemes and gazelles and drinking and boys and all the kind of pleasures that appear in these kind of poems. But rather, this is a time of thinking about mortality and one's soul's relationship to God and the world to come. So in a certain sense, there's this kind of awakening of maturity that this medieval Spanish and Islamic poetry is focusing on, an awakening to God consciousness, right? It's an awakening to transience and awareness. It's an awakening to now it's the poem of midlife crisis, right? You're now, there's a diminution, right? Whereas the remembrance of times past that Bialik is trying to do is he wants to recover for his inner consciousness the sight of a child, not the seeing of a middle-aged man. Or here in these poems, he was probably in his 30s, but he was feeling the loss of the vibrancy of the world that he saw as a kind of child's inheritance, a child's consciousness. And he, as we'll see when we look at Safri Rim, and then when he talks in the lament of one by one, these images of light are fading, echad echad, that hopefully we'll get to at the end of this this hour. Anybody want to pick up on anything more about this? Are there any stanzas that any of you want to talk about? Or the Halevi thing? Aditya, do you want to talk about any of that in terms of any of the Arabic poetry that you know, or any of the imagery? Maybe not. So I want to just give you an opportunity. Anybody who wants to say anything that we didn't say yet about, we haven't gone through all of the images, but the images of sparkling, of light, use the entire inventory of the language of childhood, but yet they do so in the consciousness of a person's memory, right? So it's a poem that's trying to retrieve for middle age an awareness of childhood consciousness. That's why there's an interesting layering of temporality here, right? Anybody want to pick up on anything that I haven't said, or that you'd like to, something about the language of the joy, either of any of those things that you want to pick up in terms of the Hebrew that we could share?
The only thing I would maybe say, I'm sorry if I meant this, you already mentioned this and I missed it, is that the what is in English, the rooster.
Oh, yes. Wait, tell me what you want to say. Tell me, you say. So that's the third stanza before the end. Let's see what he says in the English, then we'll read it in the Hebrew. Thus the gold and the joy and the laughter. Alas, for this too must be gone. Hurry, gnomes, for the morn is approaching. The rooster soon summons the dawn. Let me read it in the Hebrew, then either you make a comment. So he says, Utzchok va'alitzut v'zahav, aha, lakol tichla v'acharit. Hechavsu gamadim, higia zman kriyat hagever shel shacharit. So there's a lot of allusions here, right? What do you sense here?
I'm probably not getting any of them actually, but
I'm sure
I mean,
you're right.
the word for rooster, right, that he uses here also means man, so male, as in full-grown man, and then the dawn is shacharit, is the dawn, the morning prayer that you have to say, I think. So that also, like, there is something that gets brought together with manhood, masculinity, but also kind of the the command, the Jewish liturgical dimension, or the non-liturgical, the religious dimension of the mitzvot, of like the command.
Yeah. So let me pick up on
Burden of
let me
that.
pick up on a couple of the imagery, and this brings us back to what we talked about with Eliot and tradition and the individual talent and how he uses different kind of evocations for his audience. So this joy and the tzchok and the alitzut v'zahav, it begins with a conjunctive. In other words, he's continuing the preceding stanzas, right? And he's about to continue. In other words, there's this kind of bountiful quality that continue. Remember, what's interesting in this poem by Bialik, which is not usual in a poem, is the use of the conjunctive and he uses that as a threading. Look at vikitme, then va'ayafe, ulaor hayareach, utzlil, utzchok. I'm reading each one of that first words of each one of the. In other words, there's an enchainment of each of the stanzas that's brought together by the conjunctive and vi, right? So he's joining them the same way I said before, like he's creating a mosaic of stanzas which embodies this fragmentation, right? And so to my mind, since each one of these things is not, it's super additive, because he's trying to create a kind of crystalline consciousness of everything blowing up in your face. And because a poem will often be asyndetic, right? This is what's called syndetic in poetry, right? Syndetic means the sin, it's something with. You join conjunctions together. Asyndetic means somehow it's without the and that's what creates the kind of poetic dislocation of language that a poet often really wants to work. A poet will use asyndetic language because he wants to create the shifting of images in a way that forces your mind to move and not to glide it with this syndetic form. But so the reason I'm saying that is to pick up on Ido's thing. He then, in this third to last stanza, begins utzchok v'alitzut v'zahav, and the laughter and the joy and the goldenness. He's picking up on the preceding stanzas. He's going to continue. It's going to be another stanza, and then all of a sudden he is stopped. Suddenly he's stopped by dawn. He's stopped by the dawn, right? He can't continue with the mystery of night. Then he goes, aha, whoa, right? That's it. Aha. There's something that the poet is conveying as the inner conscious voice of the poem. Aha, whoa, lakol tichla v'acharit. Lakol tichla v'acharit will evoke to the Hebrew reader what? The book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, lakol zman. Everything has its time, because the book of Ecclesiastes is talking about the fragmentation of time. It's talking about the finitude of time. It's talking about the sequential nature of time. And that then he says, lakol zman, time has its own place, joy has its place, sadness has its place, life has its place. Remember chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, right? You can go back and take a look at that. He plays off these counterpoints. There's a time of joy and a time of sadness, a time of song and a time of sorrow, a time of birth and a time of death, etc., etc. Everything had, and of course, the issue for the person who's being spoken to in the book of Kohelet is you have to attune yourself to the rhythm of time. The whole theme word of the book of Ecclesiastes is the Hebrew word eight, time. You have to know what is appropriate for that time to live that time appropriately, right? But it's a deft and subtle illusion that I'm just trying to respond spontaneously to what you're saying. When he says lakol tichla, he's saying, but there's an end to everything. I can't enjoy this radiance forever. Even the rising of the sun is going to melt the mystery of evening. It's going to dry up the droplets on the earth. It's going to eradicate the risise, of the lila, the kind of droplets that are giving the grass a glistening, right? That's what he says, aha, aha, but. That's the ach is a strong, it's not just aha, it's aha, but there is a shift in consciousness. Lakol tichla v'acharit. If there is an end to everything, there is an end, even to joy, even to this mystery. Hechavsu gamadim. So now he speaks. So this is, who is speaking here? It's the voice who has been so silently behind the language by the light of this, la'or, by the light of this, by the light of that, by that. And all of a sudden, he directs himself in a most immediate way to speak to the gamadim. They have an actuality to them. He comes out of the shadow. The speaking voice comes out of the shadow. And he says to them, hey, chavzu, quick and be away, don't be absorbed into the light of the sun, right? The moonbeams are absorbed into the light of the sun, they won't be seen again. The sparkle will be dried up by the heat of the sun and they won't be felt anymore. Scatter, get out of here. Hey, right? That's what he's saying. Hey, chavzu. And the chavzu is, of course, evoking, that we're talking, making this occasion to allude to kind of Eliot in all these kinds of ways. So this is an allusion to the book of Exodus, chipazon. They left Egypt b'chipazon, hechavzu. You have to quick and get out, right? Get out of here fast from this kind of enchantment that you're in. They're just kind of sparkle illusions, right? He's not, the same way that the poem is filled with sparks, these verbal allusions is saying that what is higia zman kriyat hagever shel shacharit, right? So two things, right? And Ido is right. Let me just fill in the religious background to that, right? So in the first case, the word gever, which you are saying has this masculinity quality, is really, it's the cockcrow. It's the cockcrow of dawn. It's the rooster of dawn. And in Talmudic literature, for example, in the Talmud in Brachot, I think it's around page 3 or so, if I remember correctly, that is a kind of bursting of that cockcrow of dawn. There are many other kind of images of the cockcrow of dawn that awakens a person. So, but he's now alluding, some of you celebrated a Jewish festival of Passover, right? And in the Haggadah of Passover, you remember the passage that various scholars from Bnei Brak were sitting and they were discussing the exodus of the Egypt, Kol Oto Halayla, that whole night. And then one of the students comes in and he interrupts the discussion and he says, Rabotenu, my masters, Higia Zman Kriyat Shma Shel Shacharit, right? The same term, Higia Zman Kriyat Shema, the reciting of Kriyat Shema, the call to prayer, the call of God's oneness of the morning dawn. Because in ancient Palestine, ancient Israel, for the rabbis, the first call prayer is there was a particular call to prayer as the sun is rising up on the horizon. Later on, there was discussion. You can go to the first Roman watch, the 8th hour, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, depending on where you understood the Roman watch of the movement of the sun as it's going up. But the ancient times, it's the time of the Vatican in traditional rabbinic literature, where it's not just the Amud HaShachar, where light appears. These are a lot of discussions in ancient Jewish literature where there's light, the light of dawn, but it's not yet the sun. So there's certain things you can do religiously when there's the morning light, but it's not the sun hasn't come up. It's a kind of a pre-dawn, but you can do certain prayers, but not other prayers before the sun comes up. But it's the call. Higia Zman Kriyat Shma Shel Shacharit, but he is secularizing it, right? By saying it's the call of the rooster. The one word that he's changed is Shema, which is Shema Yisrael, the call to prayer, that God is one, and he's changed that to the Gever, right? By using the word Gever, he's also alluding, Ido, to liturgical prayer, right? Because the very first prayer that a religious Jew says in the morning at the dawning of the day is, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, anotein l'sechvi bina, lahavchin ben yom uvein laila," who gives the rooster consciousness to make the distinction between day and night. So it's a very old image. People live in farming communities. It's the rooster, but the rooster gives the cock crow when the light comes. So the first prayer is the mystery of awareness and gratitude of God, who gives l'sechvi bina, who gives that the rooster that notion, l'havchin ben yom, to distinguish. And so he's alluding to all of that. But when he says that happens, he's saying that's the Zman. It's a new Zman. And that remember we said Lakol Zman. He split up that phrase from Ecclesiastes, right? Lakol Tichla V'Acharit, there is a Lakol, and then Zman is that first word. It's doing double duty. It's the time of the prayer, but now is the cock crow, but it's the Lakol Zman. He has split up that phrase from Ecclesiastes, Lakol Zman, into two parts, which culturally is joined, but poetically is split apart, that creates a new polar tension, right? Of Lakol Zman. And then it's Az Techarat Hayim. Then they enter in. Now look what he transfers to them. There's this fear of evaporation, right? Their fear of evaporation, and they immediately start trooping away. Yashuvu macharishim v'nugim. They go away silently, and they go back. They return to where they were going. So it's now that personifies the moonlight that is changing to sunlight, and sunlight changes the mystery into a drying up of a certain child consciousness, and it melts away like the dream of the vision of the night. Like that, there's something about the morning light, that awakening to the morning light is that loss of the dream state, and the night. So that now puts another gloss on the whole poem. The whole poem is a dream state, right? It's a waking dream state, but it's a dream state. Does that fill in a little bit of the gap of what you were feeling about that Gever? So it's not just the masculinity, but it's Gever that has all these other qualities that are making all of these illusions and illusions, right? And the way he will split up traditional phrases to create this split. I think it's brilliant to say Lakol Tichla V'Dachrit, but the Lakol Zman is split up, and then there's an allusion to any traditional person would have had this evocation, but it's so deep within the poem, it's been totally secularized and transformed into a nature poem. Behold, nature speaks. It's the sound of the rooster, right? And then the child now has to melt away, and the moon consciousness dissipates. Any thoughts? Guys are a little silent. Think about it. Okay. So what I would I have 10 of, I guess you're 11. Why don't we would 15 minutes, 20, do you want 15 or 20 minutes? 20 minutes, would that be better? I'll give you a chance to kind of, or let's say 15 minutes. And then we'll come back to the Tzafridim I want to get back to it. And then let's see whether we have time to do echad echad. The reason I was hesitant is I thought that maybe you guys were getting a little bit, getting too much light, and you wanted to get both these poems, one that we go to the brecha for next week. Let's see where we're going. But echad echad is important. Maybe we'll see how we get to that. But I'm trying to be sensitive to how we can work with these poems between languages, and I don't want to kind of be repetitive with things like that. So I'll bring back the Jonathan Barnes. I can show you what that is. Again, The Spell of the Centuries by David Abram. It's a real, and this whole notion, as I said, of eco-poetics, a whole new area that's in consciousness and outside consciousness. So I stole a little bit of your time. So it's 5:11. So let's meet at 10 after the hour. Okay, we'll meet in 15 minutes. Don't click out, so I don't have to click you back in. Just mute yourself and cut off your screen if you want to do something private. Okay, see you then. Okay. Well, so I'm not sure, but I wanted to thank you for that because it didn't. Yeah, it's an odd use, but I think it's mostly the it's mostly to do with the. Let me just get rid of this here. It's mostly to do with the cockcrow, but I think it alludes to the fact that he's a mature. When dawn comes, childhood awareness dissipates. I think that's yeah, something like that. Anybody have any further thoughts? Any thoughts? Good thoughts? Something you want to share with me? Anything? No? Okay. Remember, Oliver, you want to send me the PDF when you can, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And anybody else, I'm
totally
not pushing anybody, but I just don't want the papers to pile up. So just so you know, it's not a big deal. It's just a way that we can stay connected. So I know that this time of the pandemic is hard to have a good sense of organized time. But discipline is important. This is not your parents speaking. This is just life experience.
Have you just a quick question? Are you allowed to go to the services in New Jersey?
Yeah, the religious services are open, but in the area that I'm in, it's very strict. So there's like a 6 to 7 foot space between people on all sides. So there are multiple venues, but people can't. So it's good. People are again together physically in the religious services, but not. There's no crowd, and very few people are actually still eating in people's homes yet. So I don't know how it is in Chicago, but yeah.
Yeah, I was.
People are looking forward. People are waiting to do that. That's.
As I was traveling back from Colorado, I went to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and entered the brewery. Huge.
Why not? Why not?
Nobody had a mask on. Just another planet.
Yeah.
Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, here there are various different. There's the state constituencies, and then there are the school restrictions, and then in my community also the rabbis have been extremely conservative about group gatherings. So people live in multiple communal structures.
Yeah.
But the religious leaders have been much more, even more cautious than the doctors have been, so to ensure people's safety. And then the school, the schools. It's interesting. Also, I don't know how it is in Chicago, but the religious schools have kept kids in school more than the secular schools. They've been working very hard to devote themselves to children's safety and create pods. So there's a big difference between how this has happened in some of the more urban environments and then in some of the religious schools have. All right, so what I want to do, anybody have anything further they want to share?
it's as reading this poem, it's amazing the variety of layers that he is able to condense uh, in layers of meaning, layers of symbolism, and of the sensualness of all of it. It's just incredible.
It is. And you have to, and in many cases, it's filled with neologisms. As he's creating, he's really creating a new poetical language of description. And even if he's using biblical language, mostly biblical language, not rabbinic language, the biblical language is put into these kinds of new coordinates that is creating totally new sensibilities. So this is very characteristic of cultures that are trying to retrieve traditional language and traditional sources and to have them inform consciousness, but not necessarily for people who would become observant, but for people for whom the canon of culture is fundamental. So this is very, very powerful in Bialik. We'll maybe talk a little bit about some of the other issues of his background. Because we've been focusing on light, but maybe I'll find some other ways to bring in some of these other issues. We certainly will in some of the other poems. Anybody else want to bring? You're absolutely right, Adrian. It's there is an erotics to memory that is very interesting. Of course, it's an adult erotics to memory. It's not the child. It's not what a child would experience. But you feel it. There's a child sensibility that's awakened. And I'm also particularly struck as we make our transition to Tzafririm, the difference again between the immediacy of any poetic effect and the sequential temporality of what it means to read a poem, between the simultaneity of any image or the simultaneity of the whole, and the way poems have to work word by word and line by line. So there's a kind of Moebius strip of the way the language bends and it's shining through in different kind of ways. Very, very powerful. And this is an inspired voice. It's an inspired voice. I'm glad that it's shining through a little bit. So what I want to do is to focus on the Tzafririm, the morning spirits, and then we'll see where we go for next time. As I said, I don't want to overwork the issue of light, but I think this Echad Echad, and maybe I'll find another poem to add to that. Do you think people would be willing to have one more poem on some of this? All right, so we'll do that. I'll find a couple of others maybe that get some more of his, the lament of loss, because that's where he's also going to be married. Then we'll turn to the Breicha, the pool, which we have to spend a whole session on, because that is a master epic of that whole romantic notion of the pool and the reflection, the reflecting gaze and things like that. So let's, did anybody have a chance to check your emails? Tzvi said that he put up on the poem, the translation by Aronin on Mooring Spirits, in addition to the one by Nevo. If you have it, otherwise, I just maybe Gideon, you'll read it for us too. I have it here too. I'm glad, because I called him in Israel early this morning while he was in the middle of something and put it on, because I came across this. There's an old edition from the 40s that I found in an old bookstore online, which has some of these poems that were really very lovely. So the other thing I just wanted to share with you, I pulled off the shelf. I misquoted his name, so I apologize. It's Jonathan Bate, not Jonathan Barnes, Jonathan Bate, and it's called The Song of the Earth. So this is considered like the classic work of this the notion of eco-poetics, trying to use from Wordsworth really right on to contemporary poetry, and also particularly Shakespeare, to kind of read the notions of space and to feel these issues. The Song of the Earth, really a very beautiful book if you're particularly interested in this kind of poetry. So I recommend that. All right, so let us do as we've been doing before. We're blessed to have a beautiful voice in Ido. So maybe if you'll read the Tzafririm, Ido, and then maybe I'll have Gideon read it in Aronon's translation while you look on at Nivo, okay? So that we can save time that way to get into the poem. But I want you to hear the language here of. So we're shifting now from night to early morning, right? Now it's the sensibility of a young boy in the morning light. That first fragmentation, and he's going to capture the same sensibility. Okay, so here we go. Safririm.
הנשיקת פי אמי עם צפצוף הדרור, תנומתי וחלומי המתוק הפסיקו. אני הקיצותי ואגודות של אור הצליפו על פניי ובעיניי הבהיקו. מעפעפיי לא נמחו עוד קורי החלום, עוד קרוביו מטפסים בקרקוב הקיר, וכבר יצהל בוקר, השתקשק היום בדהרות עגלה על מרצפת העיר. על משקוף אשנבי התנער הקן, וירעועה ויצופצף צביץ עד בלי די. ובזוהר אשנבי בפחזות חן, צפרירי הבוקר משקרים אליי. הם מפזזים ונצוצים במשובה צועלת, מתדבקים כיונים על זכוכית אשנבי, מחליקים מתחמקים באורה נוזלת, שופעת על גבי. הם קורצים ורומזים ופניהם יקרנו, אלינו צא פוחז, זרח, הזהר עמנו. עליזי גיל ילדות נפוצה, נצחקה, ובאשר נמצא אור נזה נזרוקה. בשער ראש שיבולים, בקבוצות טלטלים, על חלקת המים, בין רצי הגלים, בשחוק ילד ישן, בלב אם רחמניה, ברסיסי טל בוקר, בלחי יפהפייה. בדמעת ילדים, בכנף הציפורת, במכתות כוס זכוכית, בבואה של בורית, בכפתור נחושת, בחרוזי השירה, אלינו צא, פוחז, נזרחה, נזהירה. הם קורצים ורומזים, עיניהם הזירות, ופניהם הקטנות, מהירות, גביהם הזקות ובהירות משיקים, אורים חמים וגדולים על פניי מבהיקים. מה נמוג הלב, עיניי אפקח, אסגורה, אלוהים שטפתני האורה.
שטפתני.
שטפתני. שטפתני, לא? שטפתני האורה. הו אליי בואו זקים, צפרירי התום, אל מתחת לסדיני הצחור, הצח, שם נתפלש, נטפל עד יקון היום, ופיזזתם על אורי ובשרי הרך. הו אלי, על טלטליי, עפעפיי, שפתותיי, אלי גומות לחיי, מעמקי בבותיי, הזיקוני, שיתפוני, אל ליבי, חדורו, בואו רדו אל נשמתי, היו שם ואורו. חמדה מתוקה ונומה נופלת עליי, וכל עורק וגיד צינור תענוג שופע, והלב שוטף עובר על גדותיו בלי די, ומתפרץ כמעיין של נוגה נובע. הו מה מתוק, עפעפיי אפקחה, אסגורה, אלוהים, שטפתני האורה.
Thank you so much. So let's hear this other translation. We're in a world of discourse. The soul is speaking to the light. It's not just seeing it with his eye, but we'll see that the notion of I is extremely powerful. Okay, so maybe Gideon, if you don't have it, look at the Niveau, and we're reading the Aronin, and then you'll have that Aronin on canvas when you get the chance. Okay, please.
Morning spirits. Was it my mother's kiss? Was it the swallow with its twitter broke off my sweet dream? Lo, I awoke and seemed crowned with a halo. Legions of rays smote my eyes with their gleam. Still on my eyelids the dream web was clinging, still lingered its cherubs and would not retreat. Already the glory of morning was swinging in a galloping cart o'er the cobblestone street. The nest o'er my lintel awoke with a flutter, aroused itself quickly with shout and with song. The spirits of morning poured in through the shutter and frolicked and beckoned, a radiant throng. They sparkled in dances so joyously soaring, they beat on my pain as white doves in their glee. They glided and vanished in light outpouring and flowing abundantly down upon me. They winked and they beckoned, their faces bright beaming. Come forth, roguish one, shine with us in our flight. With childhoods exulting, we'll send our rays streaming. On all that we find, we'll sprinkle our light. On the soft tufts of sheaves, on curls and on tresses, on the smooth of the waters that sleep between crests, in the smile of a child whose lips slumber caresses, in the heart of a mother where soft pity rests, in the dew of the morn, in the cheek of fair maiden, in the pure tears of children, on the wing of a bird, in fragments of glass, in a bubble air laden, on a doorknob of brass, in the poet's rhymed word. Come forth, roguish one, let us send our rays streaming. They wink and they beckon, their eyes brightly shine. Their faces so tiny give light with their beaming, their pure brilliant bodies a flutter seek mine. Great waves of warm light come and surge on my face. My heart faints within me and melts at the sight. I open my eyes and close them apace. Oh God, I am swept, I am flooded with light. Oh, come to me, pure ones, pure spirits of morning. Come under my cover, my sparkling white sheet, and there let us play till the day gives us warning. Let me feel your bright warmth from my head to my feet. On my locks, on my lips, on my eyelids come beaming, on the dimple of cheek, then through lens of my sight. Oh, enter and flood me with radiance gleaming, cleanse my heart and my soul and suffuse them with light. The charm overpowers me, languid, sweet flowing, and each of my veins feels the flow warm and bright, till the banks of my heart, neath the surge overgrowing, are flooded completely with radiance of light. Like a fountain forth bursting, its brilliance outpouring, how sweet, how my eyelids respond at the sight. I open and close them, the radiance adoring. Oh God, I am swept, I am flooded with light.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So this is, it's a beautiful poem. It's, so what is some first impressions before we move forward? Who speaks, how speaks, what is the mood, how, Oliver?
Yeah, I was struck by the line, I guess it's the third stanza where he's listing, with childhoods exulting, we'll send our rays streaming, and then in various ways the poet explains that, you know, how those rays go streaming. And I was struck by the last of those, which is on a doorknob of brass in the poet's rhyme, and the poet's rhymed word. So there's this this sort of like euphoria or exultation from waking up in the morning, and then this is intertwined with the poet calls attention to poetic language in the middle of the poem, and sort of points out that he kind of points out his own project there perhaps, and tries to say that I'm creating this new language which we could deal with light, which is like simultaneously a mundane part. Every morning we wake up and the light floods into our room, and it's also a religious symbol that holds great meaning. So I think it's really interesting how he's
Lovely.
combining all of these aspects.
Lovely, lovely. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Right. It's the sonority of light and the remarkable diversity of its radiance and reflections, and the attempt to kind of give language. This language, which is the language speaking. It's the language of light speaking to the child. Anybody else before we look a little bit more closely? Anybody? Any thoughts? Kind of first impressions, feelings. Anything that awakens you? Any?
I-
Yeah, okay, I think any of us wake up at some point hiding under the covers and feeling the warmth somehow before, and then peeking out, and all of a sudden the light bathes the self. Yeah, Benjamin.
Yeah, I think again, in the first stanza, we have the image of eyes. I didn't look at the Hebrew, but just on the English here, legions of rays smote my eyes with their gleam. But I think there's also, like in the previous poem, there was this imagery of blinding the eyes and light as also blinding and relating back to this article on mysticism, light as something which is both overpowering or it's overpowering, and in that way it obscures as well as kind of brightens. And so again here, I think it's interesting that eyes are kind of the physical embodiment of what the narrator can see through, but the light is kind of restricting his vision here.
So there's a link, it's lovely. There's just a brief comment before we see anybody else wants to jump in. A link between what Benjamin and Oliver's saying, between the blinding presence of light and then the voice of light, right? In other words, there's a pre-linguistic, pre-thematic feel to light, right? It's the it's like the mother's kiss. It's like the feeling of a bird on one's body of some sort. It's only as the poem as the poet sort of comes to a kind of consciousness where he feels light on his windowsill, like a bird that's chirping and chirping, svits svits, this kind of primal sound, and that is calling and is radiating light. The end of that first line, elusive liquid light that showers down. So light, ha'or nozelet, ha'shofat, shofat al gabi. So here already there's this first allusion to a kind of a mystical light. This shofat is like the shefa, mystical notion of the efflux of light. In mystical terms, the shefa is this effulgence, it's an efflux, it's the flowing out of light that precedes the description of light. It's that first feeling of the totality of light. Because if you notice, after he then talks about this kind of this pressure of light, the kiss of light, the intimacy of light, the feel of light comes first. And then light speaks to him of where light will appear. So light appears and says, come to us, leap up, jump, come to us, shine with us. Enjoy your childhood with us. And then in the Hebrew, here in the English with Aronin, it begins with, on all that we find, we will sprinkle our light. In the Hebrew, is uvasher nimsa or nazen nizroka. Every phrase begins with bi, right? In or with. It's light is saying, you'll find me here, you'll find me there. We'll sprinkle our light on the soft tufts, on curls, on tresses, on smooth waters, on the smile of the child, in the heart of the mother, the dew of the morning, the cheek of the maiden, the pure tears of children, the wing of the bird. In other words, there's this second order reflection that's trying semantically to deepen what we know pre-verbally, right? That's what I think the two of you are getting at. That first feel is like the mother's kiss. It's like presence. It's an irradiation that is felt. And then light speaks to consciousness. you will find me here. Come out and join the world, and we'll see it's no longer simply this, but it's the kind of radiance in various kinds of places. Then he goes on to say in Aronis thing, the pure, brilliant bodies of flutter seek mine, great waves of warm light come and surge my face. I open my eyes, I close them apace. O God, Elohim, Shitafatni Ha'or, I am swept, I am flooded with light. So here, this, I think, was it, I think it was Gideon who asked, who was struck by that phrase, right? And you wanted to know whether it does have this very mystical power. It means to be drowned, to be immersed in light. It means to be flooded over, shitafatni. It's like it's a flood. It's that experience of being in the throes of light as a kind of baptism or immersion in light, right? To be drowning in light. That's what that's that first consciousness. And it's interesting that the first feel, and then there's that language, join us and enter into the little volumes of light. And then again, he says, I open my eyes. I open my eyes and I close them. I am swept, I am flooded with light. He goes and he says in the Hebrew, right? Elohim shetafatni, eini efkach eskora. I open and close. Oh God, I am flooded. Ha'ora. It's hard to translate that because ha'ora is also an exclamation. It's not simply saying, oh God, the light has shined upon me. I am, you could even read, oh God, I am flooded, the light, as a kind of proclamation, as an exclamation. And that God and light are one. It's a kind of, that's all that one can say about God, is simply to say God's name, to say the name, and that's the reality. Everything else is a descriptive thing that takes you away from that immediate presence. Oh God, Elohim, Lord. And then he says, then he speaks as a confession, right? Shitafatni, I have been overwhelmed. The light. So you don't know, I have, so that personal statement of confession, I have been flooded. Oh God, he speaks, so that's all he can say. Oh God is the total prayer. The I have been flooded is addressed to the God who's the nameless God. And he says, Ha'ora. We don't know whether I've been flooded by the light or I've been flooded, oh light, by light. In other words, it goes in both directions because it's that's all he can say. And that's, he hears this kind of a tingling, come, join me, come. There's something pulling from the outside, and then he comes back to that pre-verbal, but it's the verbalization of, it's not even a statement of gratitude. It's the statement of absolute splendor, of astonishment, right? It's the prayer to God when you only say God, right? Right. That's all. That is the total statement of human presence. It's acknowledging. It's a statement of acknowledging of totality, of unified totality. It's not a descriptive statement, and that's the way he's experiencing the light. God and light become one in his presence, even though he heard the call of light in these fragmentary statements. Come, join us, be wild, be boisterous, be poches, be a wild one. Come and join us, right? Be where the wild ones are. Come out and join me in the light and do that. Then he goes on, and then you see what's happened, this interesting dialogue. Once he acknowledges godliness as light, which is the awakening to this awakening, he says, then he goes on, oh, come to me, pure ones, pure spirits of mourning. He invokes them. He wants them to join him in this intimacy, right? Which now replaces that mother's kiss. There are levels of awakening consciousness, right? There's levels of awakening awareness. There's a way that the child is feeling the erotics of the mother's kiss. It's feeling the heat of the light. It's feeling the glow. It's feeling something under the covers. Its light is also the awakening to awareness of the birds outside. It's taking on this kind of thing. The charm overpowers me, sweet flowing. Each of my veins feels the flow warm and bright. So that's this transformation of they shine into his eyes. They're the faces. Ufnehem haktanot mi'irot mi'irot. Right. So what he's there's somehow there is the presence of light as the faces which are shining, and their pure bodies, behirot mashikim. The very, again, this for those who know the Hebrew, gabehem hazakot uvehirot mashikim. So that he's choosing mashikim in a very interesting way, because mashikim, don't forget what is that final line? It says orim chamim ugdolim, these warm lights, and then it says shitafani has flowed me. So the word mashikim, I think, to my ear, has multiple resonances. On the one hand, once in biblical Hebrew, but frequently in rabbinic Hebrew, lahashik is to join the flow of water. There's a kind of, so he's already alluding to the flowing of rivulets and currents of water. And then there's, of course, it's punning on the hashik of nishika, of the kiss that's going back. But it's primarily the flowing and the joining of water. So he's joined into that flow of light. And he does that through this pun, right? The pure light, bihirot mashikim. Their bodies are flowing with light, and they're kissing, and they're all of this is conveyed by this very deft pun, right? Of mashikim, which most Israelis or people who be reading it wouldn't know. Once it appears in the prophet Isaiah, if I remember correctly, and then appears in the rabbinic literature. But it's really, can you join various pools together so it provides one flow of light? And so it's a kind of a joining of a flow. But here it conveys kissing, flowing, flooding. That's what he's trying to get again. And then again, now the poet again says, "Ho, Elibo." He invites them, these pure currents of light, to dance on his skin. So notice the tactility of it. Upizaztem al ori ubisari harach. They should. There's this kind of. It's not an erotic play. Posez, piziza is a kind of. It's the tingling. It's the dancing of light on his skin, which is experienced as a tingling. It's a kind of the dance of light. Posez, when King David was coming up to bring in the book of Samuel, when he's bringing up when the ark is being brought up from Obed Edom to Jerusalem, it said that David was leading the ark and he was dancing in this kind of frivolous way, posez umecharker, right? That's the way the Bible describes it, posez umecharker. So that's what he's describing. There's this kind of the goosebumps, the tingling that's on the body is like the dance of the sprites on the body, right? And it has an erotic quality because Saul's daughter Michal looks out and she speaks derogatorily at David when he's dancing like that, and she speaks about him. Is this the way you dance before the ark of the Lord? A person with dignity, and he says, "Well, I am expressing my joy in this way," but it's mifazez. That's what Bialik wants his reader really to upizaztem al ori ubisari, right? Because now he's already harach, my tender one. And he's alluding to other kinds of psalms, right? Libi ubisari yiranenu le'el chai. My body is crying out to God. Bisari, that the body, that the physicality of the flesh has its own language of calling to God, right? That's what he's evoking in those who know this is not just a throwaway line, but he's alluding to the fact that the sensibility of flesh is in erotics that's expressing its relationship to the God who is light, And then he goes on to upizaztem alori ubusari arach. Hoy Eli, al taltalai, afapai, siftotai. Notice these kind of personal language on the locks of my hair, on the lids of my eyes, on my lips. Eli gumot l'chayai, come onto my cheeks. Mamake bivoi, to enter under my eyelids. Hazikuni. Now, notice here, he's asking again to be flooded. He's asking for this purification of childhood light. Listen, this is the language of a religious person who wants to go into spiritual ecstasy, but he's using this kind of language. He said, what does he say to the light? He says, Eli, come to me. And then he says, Hazikuni, Shitfuni, Elibi Chadoru, purify me, flood me, enter into my inner being, right? You normally would say that to God, but that is Elohim Ha'ora, right? So the secular poet feels God as light. The child who's remembering that wants God's invasion and transformation as the totality of this light. And it's a purification. It's a purification of consciousness. It's a purification of inwardness. It's a purification of life. Notice he's saying, this is the adult Bialik wanting to be the child to be purified by the sunlight, right? Right? He's not just the child. He's describing the child's transformation, but he's the poet who wants to again be purified by light, be cleansed by light. Hazikuni, right? That's the zach that he had used in the first line. Bo'u zakim, you pure ones, right? Safri re hatom. The tom is innocence. The light has an innocence. It's a purity. It's a simplicity. El mitachad l'sinei, come under the sedine hatzachor, these kind of covers, and then we'll romp together, we'll twist together, we'll joy upizastem, and then he says, purify me, flood me, right? And because he will end up by saying, Elohim, you have done this to me. It's something that speaks more deeply. I see your hand. Let me just finish the sentence. See, it goes on. Hazikuni, purify me. Shitfuni, flood me. Enter my body, enter my soul. Bo'u, come. Ridu, enter nishma, my soul. Hey, you sham ve'oru. Come there and radiate, right? Radiate. He wants to be what a mystic wants to be. He wants his body to be translucent, to irradiate that. This is the secular pope, but he speaks as a religious person. He couldn't speak this way if he was just a secular person. He understands the depth of what it means to be spiritually transformed. Yes, Titu, if you wanted to comment, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, I think especially in the last stanza, I think it sort of serves as an abridgment of like the whole poem, one, and perhaps I'm speaking in, in terms one would use to talk about Sufi poetics, and it might not necessarily work here, but it seems one as though, at least, especially the last stanza represents the boy coming of age. So there's this coming of adolescence. So first you see, he is playing with God, they're tumbling and tossing. Nice. And there's a touch, right? It's about hair and lashes and dimpled cheeks. But then soon you see that you see like this mystical progression on on the part of the wayfarer or the traveler on the mystical path. And now it's suffuse me, drench me, penetrate my heart. And now, a child doesn't care or really know about veins and tendons, right? That's really something
Nice. Yeah.
an
Yeah.
adult is thinking about, and how that, I guess, has any sort of relevance in the mystical experience. And so, yeah, so at first it's play on the part of the lover and the beloved. And
Nice.
then later on, the body really becomes a receptacle for that light. But at first, it's just play, I think. It's not, it's the leaping and dancing. And I think that's like a preface to the actual, I guess,
Yeah.
union, mystical union with the
Yeah. I think you're right. Absolutely. I think you've captured these different dimensions. And notice what he says when he says, be there and irradiate. Then he says, chemda metuka, right? It's Mahmud. The chemda is this joy, this beauty, this splendor. That's what chemda is. It's an erotic, right? A sweet bliss. That's what chemda metuka. It's a sweet bliss. When you say hamdulillah, that's what chemda is here, right? It's that bliss, that wonder, that amazement, that's sweet, right? This notion of the sweetness of mystical thing is a notion that goes actually back to Philo, to Greek material. We actually have many Greek texts where there's a drunkenness of light and the sweetness. Right. So but he's not just quoting, right? He feels there's a kind of transformation of his sensibility. Vinuma nofelet alai. Numa is a kind of it's a trance. That's what numa is. I don't know how he translates it. He says, no, it's a drowsy haze of pleasure. It's not even close. So the chemda metuka is the sweet light of God, right? It's the sweet light of God. Vinuma nofelet alai when it says when Abraham went into a trance in Genesis 15, he fell into a tardema, into a trance sleep, right? A visionary trance sleep with Abraham. Here, the numa is a kind of it's a sleep wakening. It's a trance. You don't know whether you're awake. When he uses numa, he's playing on the modern Hebrew tenuma of a sleeping, but he's playing on a rabbinic term that appears in the Talmud, that also appears in Jewish 13th century mystical literature. Nim appears in mystical literature as when they want to say that God touches but not touches. How do you say that God is intangible? So the mystic wants to say, how do you talk about tangibility, non-tangibility, right? They say it's nim. It's sort of like touching. It's like sort of like dream, not dream, awake, not awake. It's saying it's kind of it's positive, negative. That's the mystic will always talk paradoxically. But here he's saying it's a dream, and then he goes back and says, "V'chol orek v'gir." You just all of my veins are like this tzinor. That tzinor is a Jewish mystical term. It's a channeling. It's the channel that comes down from God. This is a technical term, but he's using this in a very secular sense. The tzinor ta'anug shofea. My whole body is like, I'm channeling God. That's what we say contemporary terms. But the tzinor is the way from even Neoplatonic times. It may even appear in the Sufi material, but the Jews took a lot of the Neoplatonic material from Sufi material that was coming in through the Arabic. But there is it's the coursing through the channels of the tzinorot, of these. And then he goes on to say, the halev shotef, the heart is filled, is flowing. Over al gidotav b'lidai, here he's now talking about this, but you just mentioned about the lover and the beloved. If there's an overflowingness, he's aware that there's something happening that's beyond language, that's beyond consciousness, that is something that's overstepped the banks of awareness, umit paretz, and it bursts. Kemayan shel noga novea. In the Hebrew, it's like a series of dashes. She said, "How sweet it springs," with an exclamation point. That sort of doesn't do it. And how and then it's bursting, its brilliance outpouring. But the Ma'ayan is mystical Jewish literature. It goes back to Greek. It goes back, I don't know whether it appears in the Arabic material, but the fountain. The fountain is one of the ways in which the source of light pours into the world in Jewish mysticism. So he's not, and it comes through its sinor, it comes through this channel, right? And that was the mashik, which is connected to the tzinor, the connecting aspects of that. So he's using mystical language. The ma'ayan is the heavenly fountain, right? It's the ma'ayan plays on the word ayin of I. It plays on the notion of source. It evokes the notion of this flowing that comes from infinite, illimitable places. Where does that source come from? All we know is that we're receiving it. We can't talk about the source, but we refer to it as a ma'ayan, as a fountain. Ma'ayan shel noga novea. This is language that is straight from Jewish mysticism, but it's now in a secular context, right? It is this this sense of a ma'ayan novea, this flowing, right? All of this is mystical. So he's talking, this is not just the child talking. This is this overwhelmed by the beloved, but the beloved is simply Elohim. It's Ora, it's light, right? How else, what would, Ora from this point of view is an epithet, right? Look, the name Elohim is an epithet. It's a name, but it's an epithet. And Ora is an epithet right, as well. So that's you can't name God, but you have epithets that evoke consciousness. And that's what he's doing. It's this evocation of consciousness by saying Ora, right? Light. And that's why, oh, Mama Tov, how sweet, right? So this is the sense that you can feel the divine presence. Afapai, I open my eyes, I close them. Elohim shefatatni, light, God, light. And I am transformed, transfixed. In other words, when he's beyond language, and all he can do is to say God. All he can say is ha'ora, the light. All he can say is overwhelmed. That is, so it's yes, it's nim, it's positive, negative, it's negative, positive theology, it's unsayability, sayability, right? But the poem has to end because that poem ends in silence because that's where God is, right? The poem, in this case, he says, he acknowledges this overwhelmingness, and then the poem closes. And you have to always ask, like, what is the space and the silence after a poem? Where does it take you? And in this case, the space and the silence after the poem is God, is light, right? So then you go back and you say, every space between every word, between every letter, that's the space of that light that was shining, right? That's the space of light that's shining. Because he's speaking as a mystic, as a secular mystic, but he's a mystic. He knows this language. And then, you go back to look at the spaces and the light and the ending of a poem, in any poem in different ways. But when you're reading a religious poem, that's where you've entered into that light. All of that empty space after the last word is entering into that silence. It's into that sweetness of mystery, into the beloved that you can't say anymore, right? All you could say is light, right? All you can say is the chemda. even saying Elohim is beyond, because he said he's been overflooded. Consciousness has been transformed. So here you can see who's Bialik. Is he a child? Is he adult? Is he a secular person? Is he a mystic? He is what was said of Spinoza. He's drunk with God. He's drunk with God. Okay. Secular and non-secular doesn't mean anything. That's just language from wherever you're standing. He's drunk with God. And that's why he used that term in the other one, right? Being drunk, right? He's drunk, to be intoxicated. That's the Greek language, to be intoxicated. That comes into Jewish material. That's the language of Philo, to be intoxicated. But that's, we're sort of up to time, but maybe we'll continue this next time. But I want you to feel this. Or at least I'm expressing how I'm reading the poem. You come to the end, and that white space is the nonverbal. It's going beyond aura. It's going beyond the light. Right? It's going beyond epithets. You can't say God anymore. You can't say epithets. You've entered into that space. And then because of this poem, the poem was spoken from that space. So that whole white space goes back to the very beginning, doesn't it? Right? It's like a circular thing, because he already was speaking from that space before he ended. So the whole poem is bathed in the white space of light. Anybody want to make some comments before we go in? I think it's for me, this is amazing. I hope you feel it too.
It's amazing how the fountain comes inside, and there is a point that light becomes
nice.
interior. It's first a vision, right?
Yeah,
But then
you're
it
right.
comes inside.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. You're right. Inside and outside. You're right. And that is the mystical experience. There's the flowing and that eruption from within, right? Ma'ayan. That's the Ma'ayan Novea. That appears all throughout mystical literature, right down to the 18th, 19th century. Ma'ayan Novea is a technical term, that flowing, right? Rabbi Nachman was his name. Ma'ayan Novea Makor Chachma, flowing wisdom.
As you were speaking, I was looking at Rilke, because Rilke has at least 2 poems about fountains, right? He has the Römische Fontaine.
Maybe
right?
I should. Maybe I'll make a copy of those. And
Which
I
is
think
the famous
those.
one,
I think
right?
those are his poems from. Those are his late. That's a late poem, isn't it?
Yeah, Neue Gedichte, yeah.
Yeah. That's the new one. So that was already. Yeah. Well, the Neue Gedichte is from around 1905.
Yeah.
But anyway, because the Späte Gedichte is from 1921, 22 of Rilke.
Yeah.
But those are the image poem. So maybe send me the reference. I'll make copies so we can take a look at that to see how another poet of the. I have some other things of Rilke that I was going to share with you for the pool. But maybe what else did you see besides that poem behind the Römische Fontaine?
And then this one, where is it? I shared it. Let's see.
Okay. Oh yeah, you sent a chat, but I was.
Yeah.
I
O
was
brunnen
watching.
mundu gebender du mund.
Okay. So if you send me the link, and I'll see if I can find a good translation. There's some very beautiful translations of the new poems that Adrian is referring to. And it's pertinent because first of all, Rilke is a romantic who's trying to find a new religious language, and the Neue Gedichte, the new poems, is when he's trying to see. It's right after the time that he was an apprentice to Rodin. And he wrote his material about Cézanne, and he's learning how to see. So it's the poetry of how to see, and that's really what we're seeing here, in a sense. So I'll see if I can find there's some very beautiful translations of that period. I'll only make a copy if there's some nice ones. I can't ruin Rilke here. We have to get off, but let me just tell you, my friend Adrian, but I'll tell everybody else. So I recently was looking for trying to find some of the Rilke poems in an old book dealer. I found one in some hidden away place somewhere in southern Germany of some of the collected material. I open it up and there is a letter written by Rilke and signed by Rilke.
Oh my God.
I thought I was going to go out of my mind.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'll show it to everybody online next time. But that's when you touch a poem who's touched by God, then you know you're touching something astonishing.
Wow.
All right, everybody, have a good week, and thank you for all your comments. I look forward to your papers. I look forward to seeing you again next week, and we'll continue with that one by one, and maybe I'll find some other stuff that we can do together. Okay, we'll continue with this. All right, you're great. You're great. Take
Thank you.
care. Be well.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.